that was Rose Robeson on the piano. Let's give her another hand there. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Neal. I'm president of the Lawrence County Historical Society, and I want to welcome you to this special program event being held in conjunction with Illinois Humanities as part of its ongoing series called The Country and the City, Common Ground in the Prairie State. The Country and the City, Common Ground in the Prairie State. That's a challenging title, especially here in Illinois, where the divide between the urban and the rural, and to be more precise, between Chicago and everyone else, has always been pretty daunting. Just to illustrate, I looked up this afternoon, since 2020, voters in more than 28 states have passed referendums to create statehood separate and apart from Cook County. So this evening, we're going to explore whether, with the materials of history, a bridge can be constructed across that great chasm. And to that end, we're going to focus this evening on the life and ancestry of Harold Washington, who served as Chicago mayor from 1983 until his death in 1987. Most of us out here probably wonder, Harold Washington, a born and bred politician of Chicago, what possibly could he have in common with folks here in the little hamlet of Pinkstaff? Well, we're going to find out tonight, I believe, and to get things started, I want to introduce Ferouz Abu-Ghazala with the Illinois Humanities, who is going to kick things off for us. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here and for braving this crazy, unexpected weather. My name is Ferouz Abu-Ghazale, and this is Nicole Rodriguez, and we're with Illinois Humanities, and we're very happy to have you all here and to be with you. Before we do anything, we want to thank our friends from the Lawrence County Historical Society for all the work that they did to put this event together and to get the word out, and for that delicious pie that you can get if you stay till the end of the program. I've been eyeing it since for like an hour now. And also we want to thank Pinkstaff United Methodist Church for making this beautiful fellowship hall available to us.
And in case you're not familiar with Illinois Humanities, we are a statewide nonprofit that activates the humanities through free public programs, grants, and educational opportunities that spark conversation, foster reflection, build community, and strengthen civic engagement for everyone in Illinois. So that's what we're trying to do today. We were founded in 1974, and we're the state partner for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and supported by state, federal, and private funds. So, our purpose this evening is not to endorse any particular view of Harold Washington's actions as a public official, but rather to consider what we might be able to learn about rural, urban, and interregional relations here in Illinois from his family history and his career in government. So at the conclusion of this event, prior to the pie, we hope you'll complete an evaluation survey, which is really helpful as we plan for future programs. So you probably got that at the door along with the program, so make sure to fill that out as you're getting your pie, and I'll turn it back over to Ferouz. Thank you.
All right, so now that the sun's about to come out, we're going to start with a short film that Illinois Humanities and Matt Meacham specifically produced in cooperation with Baldwin Media Development called Harold Washington, Roots, Branches, and Bridges Across Illinois. It's about 11 minutes long, so I'll leave you with that.
You might expect to find a portrait of Harold Washington, the first African American to serve as mayor of Chicago, at the DuSable Black History Museum on the city's south side, Roosevelt University, the mayor's alma mater, or Chicago City Hall. You might not expect to find one displayed in the kitchen of local historian Brendan Jennings in the rural community of Lakeview, 300 miles south of Lake Michigan's shore. But you would. Here's why.
So this is the original foundation to the Allen family homestead, where we believe that Roy Washington, Harold Washington's older brother, would have been born. It is not a standing location anymore, but we still have the foundation on the property.
Although Harold Washington's birthplace was Chicago, his parents moved there only 2 years beforehand from the Lakeview Carrier Mills area in southern Illinois' Saline County, where his mother, Bertha Jones Washington, was raised.
So Lakeview was founded between 1820 and 1830, and it was a group of families.
They came from, my understanding is, they migrated from what would be the western side of North Carolina, but previously lived in the very southern part of Virginia. Family lore states that they owned property, and because of the color of their skin, that wasn't popular, so the laws were changed, and they moved from Virginia into North Carolina. Once again, family lore. And once in North Carolina, again, the laws were changed, and then they moved into what I would call Middle Tennessee. And then over time, traveled not necessarily to Lakeview, but maybe other free communities, and then a group of them eventually ended up here. And we're fortunate in that there are a lot of representations from those families still here locally, or we are connected to them. So this isn't a community that existed and then everybody just went away. This is a very
Active community.
active, strong, proud community
Correct.
of descendants who want to carry on what our forefathers laid out.
Harold Washington's father's family also had deep roots in rural black communities in southern Illinois, as we know from a remarkable book, The Ancestry of Mayor Harold Washington by Curtis Brassfield, a specialist in African American genealogy. Harold's great-grandfather, Isom or Isham Washington, was enslaved near Lovelessville in western Kentucky and served in the Union Army during the Civil War. Around 1900, he and his family moved across the Ohio River to the Brookport area in Massac County, Illinois, where he farmed and preached at the local African Methodist Episcopal, or AME, church. Isom's son, Mac, followed his father into the ministry, pastoring several AME congregations in southern and central Illinois. Those included 2 in Lawrence County, home to a long-established black population.
The Free African American Story is what I'm going to call it. It's part of our heritage here in Lawrence County. It began over 200 years ago. They came from the South, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. So pretty well all down south is where they come from for one reason or another. Some came up with white farmers and worked as servants, and some came up, I'm sure, on the Underground Railroad, which was, we feel, is right near the Wabash River. They came in here in the very early 1800s, 1815, and they settled in, they owned land, they owned their own property, they became farmers, and they worked the land, they had their own churches, their own schools, between Pinkstaff and Russellville, 2 small towns. At one time it was even considered, it was called Little Africa. The Old Bethel AME Church was considered the mother church. It was here. It began in the 1880s, and these folks that were settled in around this area here in Bond Township decided that it was time to create a church. I believe they were having church in a home, and that's when it began. And actually, it was started out in an old log church, and we have a photo of that old log church with some of the early members of that church. There must be 100 people in there. In 1916, there was a minister by the name of Mac Washington. In 1916, he actually founded and started the St. James AME Church in Lawrenceville on 11th and Ash Street. So the country folks were attached to the Old Bethel Church, and the townsfolks were attached to St. James, but they did combine services, and it worked out quite well. And as a youngster, I remember going to the Old Bethel Church as well as the St. James Church.
Another youngster who undoubtedly attended both Bethel and St. James churches was Reverend Mac Washington's son, Roy. Roy Washington graduated from Lawrenceville Township High School, one of the few racially integrated high schools in southern Illinois at the time, around 1917 or 1918. In 1916, he had married Bertha Jones of the Lakeview Carrier Mills area, where the couple lived and had 2 children before moving in 1920 to Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. There, Bertha pursued a musical career, while Roy became an attorney, a Democratic precinct captain, and a part-time AME minister. Their son, Harold, the future mayor, was born in 1922. Several members of their immediate family remained in southern and central Illinois. According to local memory, young Harold Washington occasionally visited Saline County. Harold Washington's connections to small communities in downstate Illinois differentiated him from many other Chicago-based public figures of his era, including many of his fellow African-American elected officials whose families had come from the Deep South during a subsequent phase of the Great Northern Migration. That raises an intriguing question. How did Harold Washington's family roots in rural Illinois influence his perspective on urban-rural and interregional relations within our state? The answer to that question has proven more elusive than we at Illinois Humanities anticipated when we began investigating it. According to associates of Mayor Washington who've generously shared their recollections with us, he rarely mentioned his family ties to downstate communities and never told them how that aspect of his background influenced his work as a public official. Furthermore, although much has been written about Mr. Washington's family history and about his career in government, little has been written about any connections between the two. Maybe the answer to our question is to be found in an interview that we haven't yet heard or an archival document that we haven't yet studied. We do know that his family tradition of Methodist preaching inspired his love of language and penchant for public speaking. We also know that during the historic 1977 leadership election in the Illinois State Senate, the Black Caucus, led by then Senator Washington, cooperated extensively with the predominantly downstate Democratic Study Group led by Terry Bruce of Olney in pursuit of reform. When Harold Washington ran for mayor of Chicago in 1983, the editorial page of the Carbondale-based Southern Illinoisan proclaimed him the candidate most likely to foster a harmonious relationship between the city and downstate. In 1986, he became the first Chicago mayor in living memory to make official visits to central and southern Illinois cities such as Peoria, Champaign, and East St. Louis, meeting with local leaders about potential opportunities for collaboration. Mayor Washington commented, "The time has come for the mayor of the city of Chicago to relate closely and honestly and genuinely with other mayors, village presidents, and county board presidents." It seems reasonable to speculate, then, that perhaps Harold Washington's family roots were among his motivations for seeking mutually beneficial cooperation between Chicago and other regions of Illinois. It's also at least tempting to speculate that even during contentious episodes in the rough-and-tumble politics of 1980s Chicago, Mayor Washington kept in the back of his mind the virtues that Denise Drew and Brendan Jennings associate with Lakeview.
As far as what the people of Lakeview represent to me, they represent grit, determination, fortitude, hard, earnest work, belief in God, belief in community, and belief in education. It has been said that there's many people from this community who entered high school and were done at 16 and went on to university. We have doctors, lawyers, you name it. We had people who came from Lakeview who were at a time when maybe all the odds were against them culturally, maybe being a woman or whatever, who strived. They never let those things hold them back. They kept pushing forward.
Lakeview to me symbolizes, and the community here symbolizes resilience, it symbolizes strength, it symbolizes humility, and the American dream even in the face of adversity.
Good evening. Thank you for coming, everybody. That was a wonderful video, and I've enjoyed it watching that very much. I'm John King. I farm in Lucan Township, south of Bridgeport, but I've been actively interested in helping Larry Curry develop some of the African American history here in Lawrence County. So the title of my presentation is Ripples from Pinkstaff. Here is a the AME church is here, believed in immersion. This is a picture from the Ambrol River, although normally they used a gravel pit east of Pinkstaff. But here, there's ripples going out, and ripples give positive energy, and maybe a ripple can turn into a wave. And the ripples we make, we don't know what they'll reach or how we might be influenced or how we might influence others. Ripples go out and they hit one another, and who knows? And so that's what I'm trying to talk about this evening. Reverend Mac Washington, he was the son of Isom and Rebecca Washington of Ballard County, Kentucky. That is just to the south and east of Cairo, Illinois, so not that far from here. He's the father of Roy Washington and the grandfather of the Mayor Harold Washington. Mac Washington served two churches here in Lawrence County. Starting from the newspapers, it appears that he arrived here in November of 1915 with his family. The St. James Church was starting to meet, and he was assigned to the Bethel Church, and then he did the preaching at the St. James, led the St. James congregation in building a new building, and we've all seen pictures of that. Here's some more people coming in. So. Mac Washington was the minister at both Bethel and St. James, but we have recently discovered that there was a Zion AME church started in 1853. This is 5 miles to the southeast of Pinkstaff in Russell Township, across the road from John and Jane Benson. And this congregation lasted into the 1870s. There's great influence on the young men, African American men who enlisted into the 28th U.S. Colored Infantry during the Civil War. And the trustees there were very active in this church and very much influenced. I believe that once the Zion Church faded, then the Bethel Church was started up. Point out to you that this picture of the picture here of the early Bethel, that's 1900. The log cabin is still standing. The frame church is pictured here in the background. This is where Mac Washington preached. Here, my fat thumb here, excuse me. The frame church burnt in 1945 or 1946. It was replaced by the present brick building that is now used as a personal residence. And notice the manse to the east of the brick Bethel Church. And this is where Mac Washington would have lived with his family. And there's the next speaker, Brendan Jennings, is just walking in the door. So I'm glad to see him. This is, so that's fact. Mac Washington served two churches in Lawrence County, 1915 through 1922. Fact, his son Roy graduated from the Lawrenceville High School in the spring of 1917. This young man was good to go on to become a lawyer, successful lawyer in Chicago. They believed in education. The father certainly influenced his son to pursue his education. Now, Roy here's a picture of him in the Glee Club and in the chorus. From the yearbook of this year, he seems to be the only black student at Lawrenceville that year. And he was married in the summer of 1916, so he's probably the only student there that had a new wife and a new baby, and that's Harold's older brother, Roy Jr. This slide I'm trying to represent to you that Mac Washington was a good fit for this congregation. This was a congregation of mostly farmers, and Mac Washington had been a sharecropper with his father in Kentucky, so he could talk farmer talk just as well as anybody. The video showed this picture of trustees of the Bethel Church in the late 40s, 1950s, and now let's concentrate on the two men on the very left. Charles Borman, his parents were slaves in Kentucky. Charles's father was a Civil War soldier. He enlisted in the Union Army without the permission of his master, Josephine Borman. They came to Lawrence County, bought a farm after the Civil War, and established. So they were determined to get out of Kentucky, and they chose this as a good place to come. Which leads me into the next slide. I thought that Curtis Brassfield had done an excellent job, and he did do an excellent job giving you the background of the stories. I was determined last winter to find something that this man had not found. And I found it in the Freedmen's Record on FamilySearch.org. And it turns out that Mac's mother thought it was an injustice for her former master, John N. Neal, who lived west of Lovelessville and west of Blandville, towards Woodville. I haven't found Woodville in the map, I found Blandville. He kept two of Rebecca's girls, not in bondage, but probably he would have said indentured servitude. He liked those girls and he was going to keep them. And he went to court in Ballard County and said that Rebecca was not capable of taking care of their two daughters. She came up for air. She went to the Freedmen's Bureau. She fought this out. Anyway, Mac was Isom and Rebecca were both slaves. I do not know who owned Isom, but he was surely a slave. At the end of the war, he served as a substitute in a heavy colored artillery unit. And with that, he was able to buy a farm, about 55 acres, and start out and then be able to convince the court that they could indeed take care of their children. But of course, as farming goes, then and now, it's tough. And he fell behind. There's many online mortgages where he had to take out mortgages for his crop. He was lending money to some of his neighbors, but hard times followed. He lost the farm, and then he was a sharecropper. But he's also an AME minister, found many marriage records of ceremonies that he had performed. And eventually, as an old man, his health was broken. Mac and his new wife had come back to help him farm, but they all moved across the river to Brookport, Illinois, in Massac County for a new start. So Isom was a AME minister, so was Mac, and so was Mac's brother, William. So Mac and William served many churches through southern Illinois for the next several decades. The other man I want to talk about is Benny Anderson, who lived near Turkey Paw to the east of Pinkstaff. And he represents that most of the African Americans were free blacks. They had been free for generations. They had been here before the War of 1812. So Benny's great-great-grandfather, Jesse Anderson, was slaughtered by Indians to the southwest of Fort Allison. His son Caleb witnessed it. This is also an ancestor here. So this black family was at Fort Allison. John Morris, of course, we know about John Morris as being, he came in 1809. He was a member of the Mariah Creek Baptist Church across the river in Indiana. He a church that believed in anti-slavery and abolition, and they weren't about to let any slaveholding person be a part of them. And then he was a member at the Little Village Church, and I suppose on the Canaan Baptist Church. So this is a line of Baptists. I don't know when the Andersons became AME, but of course Bethel, I'm sure they had the majority of the African Americans in this community. Also, I want to point out that Benny Anderson is his great uncle Matthias Sugg Anderson was killed by a white vigilante gang in 1862. Just where was that at? In the coal woods east of Pinkstaff. The account actually made a letter from Vincennes, made it into the New York Times. Then there's a couple other newspaper articles, but I'm sure this helped motivate the young men of the Zion Church to join the Union Army when it became legal to do so, because they wanted to make things better for themselves, for this community, and for the racial issues across the nation. Brings us to this slide. Here's a picture of Benny Anderson's first cousin, George W. Anderson. The newspaper column on the left came out of the Lawrence County News in 1st of May, 1918. 5 men had been drafted, men of color, to be drafted into the Federal Army, be sent to France. George did not join the group. He went ahead and enlisted. Here's a ceremony at the St. James Church led by Mac Washington, his counterpart from Vincennes. And here's George Anderson as a speaker telling about his Army experience and training and advice. The 4 others, a Joyner, a Hardiman, Troy Anderson, a brother of Benny, was sent off to Rockford, Illinois for training, along with this group, and then Bill C. Russell. So an interesting account here. They described George W. Anderson, a colored boy who had finished a 3-month. In this column, George Anderson, and I didn't know this, he had spent 2 years at Wilberforce University at Wilberforce, Ohio, AME College near Dayton, Ohio. This is a time when most people of the rural areas of Lawrence County did not go to high school, let alone on to college. Some did, not many. Here's a family that managed to put their son 2 years at a college in Ohio. George went ahead. This article is interesting because here's Benny Anderson and the children. We're at this New Year's Day celebration at his parents, Wright Anderson. And here's Edith and George. George here. Here's Edith, his sister Edith. She married Martin. So this is Edith Martin of Chicago. George lived in Chicago. They knew, so here's two people that had lived here in Pinkstaff, lived out their lives in Chicago. Whether they ever voted for Mayor Washington or not, I don't know. So, and of course, Edith's son, Butch Martin, has been living back in the Pinkstaff area now for several years on the part of the family farm that's been in their family for over 200 years. Here's a picture from the dedication of the New Bethel Church, the brick structure in 1946. This is an interesting guy. Bishop Gregg. He'd been a missionary in South Africa to the struggling blacks in an all-white nation, controlled by all whites in South Africa. He had declined the presidency of Howard University in Washington, D.C., because he wanted to stay in South Africa. But his big thing here, notice that he ordained Harold Washington's father, Roy, to be an evangelist in the AME Church in 1942. So round and round we go, all the interconnections. And here is this man who had been chief of chaplains of the colored chaplains in World War II. Here he is in Pinkstaff dedicating a church in 1946. He wasn't, and he had been president of Wilberforce, where George had been. Their years were different, but yet the interconnections that we have, the ripples that go out, there's no stopping them. And we don't know who we may influence on any given day, and our influence may not be felt for years to come, but those ripples do go out. So, did ripples from Pinkstaff make a difference in the political rise of Harold Washington? It's something we can ponder. So that completes my presentation.
Thanks again for John King for this great presentation. Another round of applause. Okay. And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Brendan Jennings from the Lakeview Carrier Mills area in Saline County. He's going to come up as soon as they get the presentation ready. And thank you for coming and braving the weather.
Thank you for having me. I braved the storm to get here, so I survived. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brendan Jennings. I am a historian out of Saline County. Just a little bit of background of what I do. I ran for office in Saline County for Saline County Board. I won't tell you what ticket I ran on. I lost, so I'll let you figure out which ticket that was. So, won't do that again. But my primary path through the past, and I'm 38, so what I've done for the past 10 years is take over my father's work. He was a historian at the Saline County Historical Society, and he and my mother, which one? That one? There we go. Nope, that one. So him and my mom wrote the Allen Family Chronicles, and my father mapped out Lakeview Cemetery, which is, we believe, one of the oldest, I'll just say one of the oldest African-American cemeteries in the state of Illinois. My family are the Allens. My grandmother was an Allen. I live on the property that the original farmstead that was built in we believe 1830 was the first house that was built there. But the Allen family had been in Lakeview since the War of 1812. So that's how long my family's been on that property. So I still own the property deed, and I have lived on that, well, I own a 200-year-old piece of property. So, and it's been in my family continuously for that amount of time. The Allen family is very large. We have family in North Carolina, California, New York. It's a massive family, and we originally come from North Carolina, around Buncombe County, North Carolina. That's where we originally came from. The Allen family is one of 5 major families that came to, I'm going to give rough numbers here, 5 or 6 families that came here around the War of 1812. They were freed African Americans, so they were freed slaves or runaway, and but they were free when they got here. Let's see. So the historical backdrop, so Lakeview was founded at a racially volatile time in Illinois history, which leads to record gaps within the Gallatin County plat maps and squatters maps. And within the area of Lakeview between 1840 and 1820, the maps claim that there were 0 settlers between the South Fork of the Saline River and Carrier Mills to the north. But we know that that's not true. The black people that were living in that area were hiding in the swamp, and that's where we were and still are. We know from genealogical and census records that this is not true. The Taborns and the Allens were living in the area with well-settled farmsteads and land holdings by 1850 with adult children. So this book here, the Shawneetown Land Entry Plat Maps from 1814 and 1820, is where the earliest writing or record of any landowners that were in that area during that time. So this was before the towns of Carrier Mills and Harrisburg were even founded. So Carrier Mills was founded in 1872. Harrisburg was founded in 1854, and both towns were non-existent. Harrisburg at the time was a 60-foot sandstone bluff covered in a thicket of hazel underbrush, is what they called it. And there was nothing there. There was nothing there. Settlers that lived in the Shawneetown area, the Stone Fort area, because there's an ancient Native American fort there called Stone Fort, and there were settlers that were living in that area. And then Raleigh and Equality, which were tied closer to Shawneetown. So Gallatin County had people living there, particularly in Shawneetown. They founded the first courthouse in Raleigh. And then people in Stone Fort would get lost in the woods trying to get to Raleigh. So they had this big court case because they were demanding to move the county seat to a more centralized location, and apparently they rigged the votes. So at that point when they rigged the votes, Harrisburg won. Harrisburg was founded, named after James Harris, the first settler who owned the property there on the town square. And then Harrisburg boomed after that. The coal mine boom came, and by 1937, Harrisburg had close to 15,659 people in Harrisburg. Now they only have 8,000. All right. Slide 2, the information found within Gallatin County Slave Register proves why there's a lack of recorded information. This registry shows numerous freed slaves that were being sold back into indentured servitude between 1815 and 1839. So we have more evidence of this due to the records that were kept at the Crenshaw House, or the old slave house in Equality. Some of my family, some of the Allen family, did move through the Crenshaw House, but for the most part, most of the members or family members in Lakeview managed to escape capture. But we did have the Klan come into Lakeview several times to try to snatch family members. But my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather and his brothers all lived at the entrance of town, and anytime an angry white mob would come to Lakeview, they would all stand out in the middle of the road with weapons and scare them back to Carrier Mills. And that worked apparently more than one time from what my great-grandmother told me. So according to oral history, our families were hiding in the woods, possibly alongside natives during that time. This leads to a strong need for archaeological studies within Lakeview to prove our existence before the key 1830 date. Any evidence prior to that date could surpass Brooklyn, Illinois, as the oldest African-American settlement in the state. So what you're seeing here, this information I presented to the state to try to get a historical designation for Lakeview. This happened in 2022. So some of this information is kind of mixed in with what I'm presenting to you guys, but it's still relevant. We don't know what the oldest African-American settlement is in Illinois. It really boils down to that. We have an idea of what the oldest African-American settlement is, but it's multiple settlements that were all put together or founded within a 20-year period. And that's what we do know. Lakeview's one of them. So the fear of capture kept the black families in Lakeview hiding until it was safe to record their presence on official documentation. So we know that's true. It was.
What time period was that?
For which part?
Being safe and being able to document yourself.
I can say that it was before 1865, names started to appear. And I think it's as Illinois became safer, because in the early days, black people could not travel without travel papers. And I don't know the exact date of when that changed or when that stopped, but it was before the Civil War. Yeah, it was before the Civil War. After the Civil War, everyone had their names on documentation. Also, you have to realize a lot of these families were passing as white. They were light-skinned, they were biracial, or mulatto as they called us back then. And sometimes we were mulatto by force. There's a long history of sexual assault that occurred during this time frame. So a lot of black families weren't 100, most of them were never 100% black. And this is a very uncomfortable topic, but it needs to be spoken about. You know, it's part of history. I know for the Allens, at least one brother was passing. I know that for sure. So it was said that once you entered the pond, you never left the pond. That's what the old timers said in Lakeview. And in terms of new residents moving to Lakeview. So a lot of people would come in and then that doesn't mean they disappeared. It just means they moved in and they were comfortable and they had no reason or want to move out. And it was safe, that's why. If our African American ancestors were living in the area before 1830 and hiding, justice and acknowledgement is, in my opinion, overdue and deserved. I still think that's true. I said this during, when I presented this at the Saline County Tourism Board in 2022, and I still think that the story needs to be told accurately, or it needs to be more well-known. So this is a poem, or this is a, let's see. So this was Lucille Moreland. She wrote one of the books. I did not bring none of the books with me today. Or ran out the door in a hurry. She wrote one of the books that was written about Lakeview. There's about 4 or 5 that are written. And she says here that Lakeview is now on the map. The Saline County Tourism Board has placed the Lakeview on the Saline County, home of the Shawnee National Forest tour map. So we had a marker that was put in my front yard in the 90s, and my dad led the charge for that, so it was in 99. And I have a picture of that marker in the slide I'll show you in a few. So that's what this was. This was the Lakeview Cemetery Committee, and she was on the committee at the time, coming out and saying, hey, we have a new marker. That's in short what this is. And then this is the poem by Lucille Cole Moreland, where she talks, and this was a ancestral poem, so this came from, I believe, her mother or her father, one of the two. And she was she was, I believe, in the 90s. So this comes from the 1800s. So in the 1820s, they first arrived from North Carolina. 1830, 24 people resided in homes totaling 4. This number grew. Soon there were more. From Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and from Alabama too, they came on the low uplands just north of the Saline Fork of this river Saline. They established a settlement 4 miles square with swamps and lakes nearby encircling them there. Self-sufficient and industrious, they hunted and farmed for food, traded surplus crops and hides for things they themselves could not produce. In 1850, they built a church, which also served as a school. By 1880, there were 128 folks in 31 households. So this shows how the settlement grew. In 1900, a school was built. The settlement had many a change. No longer was it Pond Settlement. Lakeview was now its name. So I love this poem. It almost makes me cry every time I read it because it reminds me of my grandmother so much. Because that area, just the importance of the roots in the ground, and not black land ownership is hard to come by in this country. So it's something that needs to be cherished, that the fact that we have it at all. Even still to this day, we still hold on to it. So why is Lakeview significant? Possibly the oldest black settlement in the state, formerly known as Pond Settlement or Cypress Pond, founded between 1880 and 1820. 1838 is the official date. Established as a freedmen's town by a group of African-American runaway slaves and freedmen who immigrated from North Carolina shortly after the War of 1812. It was never a formal village or community. Lakeview covered a series of farmsteads concentrated about 4 square miles. Possibly 13 indigenous families assisted Lakeview arrivals. So this comes from oral tradition. We don't know this for a fact. We need an archaeological dig to prove it. We already had one archaeological dig in 1978, 72, I'm sorry. So we had one archaeological dig in 72 for the Native American burial grounds that were nearby Lakeview, and they briefly touched into the community of Lakeview itself to try and date some of the homesteads, but the archaeological dig was very limited, and we need a larger one, a broader one at this point. But we believe that 13 indigenous families were assisting the black families when they first got here. Memorial Day celebration is a tradition back going several generations. My grandmother said that my great-grandmother said they were doing Memorial Day. Her father's father was doing Memorial Day weekend when he was a child, and he was born in 1888. So we know that the tradition of all of the families gathering on Memorial Day and having a massive community-wide family reunion started at least then. Families moved to the east end of Carrier Mills in the early 20s, or the early 20th century for closer access to the coal mines. So we also know that's true. So the Union Church or Mount Zion Church, so this is a church at Lakeview Cemetery with an 1869 completion date. The first church was. I believe this building was built in the 1880s. I do not believe it was built in 1869. This is a Baptist church. I requested for core samples. I know that the Henry Cole Rectory is a building that sits next to it, which is basically a dining hall. I do know also that we are trying to turn it into a future museum, but we don't know if it's structurally sound at this point. So now we're looking at another option for a museum, and that is going to be the Baber Chapel AME Church, which I'm going to talk more about here in just a moment. I should have put these slides in order. So Lakeview Cemetery. So we have Buffalo Soldiers at Lakeview Cemetery, 1866 dates on the stone. It was formerly called the Union Cemetery, formal founding possibly 1838. Land was given by Zachariah Taborn, and according to Jewel Caulfield's book, which you can find at the Carrier Mills Library, they're selling it right now. There was a stone dating to 1822 in the cemetery in the 1970s, but that no longer exists. Now there is a stone with a birth date, of 1822 or 1820, but there is not a stone with the death date of 1822. But by the 1970s, there was still a stone there, dating back to 1822. We'll skip that part. Spanish and American war veterans. There are several current cemetery maps that exist. My father put together one, or actually wrote one of them. It's a very thick book, about this big, with all of the people that are buried at Lakeview. And we also know that there are hundreds of unmarked graves. There are unmarked, if anyone has ever been to Lakeview Cemetery, there is a circle drive, and the church and the cemetery sit several, I would say 50 to 60 feet off the road, but we know that there are graves, unmarked graves, that come all the way to the road. And so you're driving on them, you're walking on them. The cemetery is full of people all the way to the road. Current monuments on the grounds, we have 4 of them, 3 stones and an archway, and we have a obelisk that was dedicated in 1996, and I have photos of that I should have brought, and I did not bring that either. But I was there. I was only 10 years old when they did that. So Lakeview School, there is no school anymore. It is the site of. There was a foundation, and the landowners even pulled the foundation out 2 years ago. And now there's this big pile of concrete sitting where the school used to be. The first church was a very old log church that burned in 1880 on property donated by Bird Tabern. So we're still trying to find out where Bird Tabern's land was, and we may be able to find the remains of the first church in Lakeview. Lakeview is the only non-segregated school in Saline County. It was integrated. There were white and black kids both going to Lakeview School early on, in around the turn of the 20th century. Several black professionals have come from Lakeview, including Archie Jones, the first black city councilman of Carbondale, and John Livingston Tabern, who had 200 graduates under his tenure, and many went on to have professional careers: doctors, lawyers, basketball players, musicians, actors, you name it. He taught them, and he is my great uncle. So he married my great-grandmother's sister, oldest sister. So this is the map of Lakeview. So if you go north here, this is Route 45, but Carrier Mills sits about here. Harrisburg sits about right up there. There are sunken road beds in Lakeview, which shows the age. There are alleyways and carriageways. My front yard, when you exit my front steps of my house and go to the edge of my property, my house sits 8 feet off the road. The road is down in a hole, basically, that runs in front of my house. And my grandmother said that's from carriages over the decades that just kept going back and forth, and they just dug a trench. And so the front of my ditch bank is the edge of a sunken lane, which you really only see in Europe and the East Coast, so that shows the age of Lakeview. Lakeview map is available, so I have a big map available in a KMZ file for Google Earth. Foundations of homes and wells and farmsteads. We have foundations of extant churches, foundations of Lakeview School, and a possible archaeological overlap of natives and black families living together, ? So this is really from my 2022 presentation to the Saline County Tourism Board and the Historical Society, begging them for an archaeological dig, which I was like, please come out here with shovels so we can prove this. So multiple sites, archaeological dig needed. And you can tell it was really a cluster of homes. It was never really a full town with multiple streets. There's my house, sits right here at Irvin Allen on the Ransom's corner. And then we had one store called Finney Market that existed. The Mount Zion Baptist Church, the First Church of God. The school sat here, and here was John Allen's AME Church. And I'm going to tell you the history of the AME Church. This is the fun part. So let me just start here with this. So the AME Church was founded here, and then they moved it into town to about right here to the Morelands farm. And they were trying to get it into town, but Ed Moreland came out on his front porch in 1920 when they were moving the church across his field, and he walked down to the bottom of the field, and he looked at the men pulling the thing on their horses and the donkeys, and he said, "It sits right here." And they said, "What do you mean it sits right here?" He said, "The church sits right here and doesn't move," is what he said, just like that. "I own the church, it's on my property now." That's what he did. So it sat there for a very long time until, it sat there for a very long time. I can't tell you exactly how many years, but it was years it sat there. And then they moved it into town. Now, Irvin Allen had, before this one was built, he had a church that sat in my front yard called Irvin Allen AME. I have a photo of that I'll show you shortly. And it was basically a wood structure, like a galley house. It was not very big, and it was just a row of, 2 chairs on each side down the middle, and there was a front door and a back door. That was the whole building. It was made of wood. It looked like a log cabin. So, and he moved that down here and built a larger church, and then they moved it back into town again decades later. So the east end of Carrier Mills. So what is on the east end? We have Dunbar School, several black churches with direct ties to Lakeview. Black American Legion was on the east side of town. My grandfather actually ran the Black Legion in Carrier Mills, and there was a need for a Black Legion because the Legion was segregated. Black people could not go to the White Legion in Carrier Mills. Black Military Memorial for Gary Jones. Gary Jones was a veteran who was killed during the Vietnam War. He was very young. Many black families moved to the east side of town during the coal boom. So the coal boom roughly correlated between 1890 and 1930 in Saline County. That was the coal boom. Due to these factors, it is considered a de facto extension of Lakeview. Most of our families moved into town during this time frame. The coal boom, we went primarily from an agricultural community to an industrial community at that time. It was a shift. And I know that in my family, on the Allen family, my great-great-grandfather went from being a farmer to a coal miner around 1900, and by 1920 had lost 2 fingers on one hand and 2 on the other. So here's the Lakeview map of the historical district I proposed. We are writing the injustices of the past. Man, I'm trying to go quick. Okay, Lakeview's connection to historical legacy. So Harold Washington was Chicago's first black mayor, has deep family roots in Carrier Mills. His parents, Roy and Bertha, moved to Harrisburg in 1916. Their first son, Roy Jr., was born on August 15, 1916, at Ransom's Corner in the Allen family homestead. Like I said, the Allen family were the stewards of the AME church in Carrier Mills. Harold's grandfather, Mac Washington, was a farmer turned AME minister serving churches across Illinois, and the Allen family had foundational ties to Irvin Allen AME in Lakeview and Schaefer Chapel. There's my grandmother. There's the church. There's the Ransom's, the Allen family farmstead in 1920, 1970, and what it looks like today, nothing. There's nothing there. But this has been the story of almost every farmhouse in Lakeview. It's just as people move away and then we come back, all we have left are foundations. So Roy Jr. served in the U.S. Army's Cavalry Division during World War II and worked in Cook County government for 21 years. He was a talented draftsman. Roy Jr. designed the Harold Washington Mausoleum, where he and his brother are both buried. And in 1998, the Illinois House of Representatives passed Resolution 463 to honor Roy Jr.'s legacy. Lakeview and other historic black settlements in southern Illinois were vital in fostering leadership and resilience. This is the House resolution itself. So I wanted to actually show you the House resolution. Because I tell people this and they're like, really? And I'm like, yes. And here's proof. They put it in the House in Illinois. He was from Carrier Mills. So that's where he was born. This is the first Irvin Allen AME church. This is the Lakeview sign. So we believe Mac was a traveling preacher and came to Carrier Mills, and he knew my family very, very well because Roy Jr. was born in my grandmother's living room. I know that. So they knew each other that well to where, and Bertha, my great-great-grandmother's also name was Bertha, so they both had the same name. So she went into labor in the living room. All right, I think that's it. Yes. So that's the ties of Harold Washington and Carrier Mills and Lakeview. I wish I could say more. I could go on for hours about this topic. That's the thing. I know so much. But thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Brendan. We really appreciate that, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end in case anyone would like to ask questions or make comments. Excuse me. I'm Matt Meacham. I'm Program Manager for Statewide Engagement with Illinois Humanities, and we're about to be joined by two guests from Chicago. I just wanted to say very quickly before they join us, the film that we showed earlier mentioned the 1977 state Senate election and the fact that it brought together the Black Caucus led by Harold Washington, who was a state senator at that time, with the Democratic Study Group, which was a group of relatively newer legislators, mostly from downstate, in pursuit of reform. And I just wanted to let you know, in case you're interested in learning more about that particular episode in Illinois legislative history, which is really an interesting one, and I think there's a lot to be learned from it. There's a wonderful study by Ken Busby, who was a state senator at that time and was part of that Democratic Study Group. He was from the Carbondale area. And if you go to the website of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at SIU Carbondale, that's the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at SIU Carbondale, look up Ken Busby and look up his study about that episode in Illinois political history. Technology permitting, we're going to be joined in just a moment by two friends from Chicago. Well, we're honored to be joined by an eminent journalist and commentator from Chicago, Laura Washington, who was a deputy press secretary in the administration of Harold Washington when he was mayor, and Dick Simpson, who was a Chicago alderman during that same period. He is also a professor emeritus of political science from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and an author. Let's all welcome Laura and Dick from Chicago. Well, Laura or Dick, whoever would like to begin, can you tell us why, in addition to the fact that Harold Washington was the first African American to serve as mayor of Chicago, why his election and his tenure in office were so significant in terms of the social and political dynamics within Chicago?
I can go first, Laura, and then you can give a more intimate view from inside the administration. So yes, Harold was the first black mayor in Chicago history, but he's important because he changed the balance of power both between the races And perhaps even more important, he changed the political culture and the history of Chicago, and some would argue even the United States. Because he was the first black mayor of Chicago, he laid the groundwork for the election of Carol Moseley Braun, the first black woman senator. He has laid the groundwork for the current mayors of Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot and Mayor Johnson. And perhaps most visibly on the national stage, in many ways, he paved the way for President Barack Obama. Now, as a candidate for mayor and all through his career, he fought against the machine. And the Chicago Democratic machine had governed and choked Chicago from 1871. Harold, on the other hand, made a Rainbow Coalition manifest in City Hall, and his reform platform is his legacy. Now, if Harold had just supported any one reform, and Laura can talk about some of them, that would have been noble. We would still remember her. But standing for all the reforms, what we now call progressive reforms, changed Chicago history permanently. I like to do it as a before Harold and after Harold. Before Harold Washington, Chicago was governed, as much of the state was, by political patronage hierarchy. But Harold signed the consent decree outlined patronage hierarchy. Before Harold, citizens didn't even have a right to the government documents their tax dollars produced. When I was older, I'd have to take a yellow pad and a pencil and go to the comptroller's office, even as a public official, to get the data. But Harold issued the Executive Freedom of Information Order the first day he was in office. And perhaps even more importantly, and it's hard to quite believe this, but he passed the first ethics ordinance in Chicago history in 1987. Before Harold, there was no affirmative action in city jobs and contracts that we have today. Before Harold, the city's infrastructure was falling apart, but he passed the largest neighborhood bond ordinance in Chicago's history up to that time, millions of dollars that went into building the infrastructure, not only in the black community or the minority communities, but also in the white communities. So the way many people who are supporters of Harold put it is the floor of city government was permanently raised. A black had been elected mayor, and after that we had minority school superintendents, police chief, affirmative action, and jobs and contract. Harold liked to say the Chicago machine was dead, 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 and that wasn't quite true. But it was weakened, and Harold led us to a new Chicago, and I think to a better America.
Thank you very much, Dick. Really appreciate those insights. Laura, what would you like to add?
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Dick. It's just a real pleasure. Thank you for, asking me to join you tonight. It's been fascinating to learn the history of Southern Illinois and Harold Washington's connection to it. Matt, as you know, it's been a challenging thing to answer that question. Matt, you came to me some weeks ago, with that question, and I've been pondering it ever since. And actually, one of the things about me that you should know is that my name is Lord Washington, but I have no relation to Harold Washington. I don't have that history in Southern Illinois with him. But it's important to note this because when Harold was mayor and I was working for him, he had an incredible personality and tons of charisma and a great sense of humor. I spent time in his office chatting with him, and we would talk about the fact that both our last names were Washington, and we would marvel at that. And one time we were chatting, and he asked me, "Have you ever met a white Washington?" And that was a very interesting question to me, because I'd grown up on the south side of Chicago among African Americans. There were many African Americans by the last name Washington. If you found a phone book, the good old phone book, and went through it and looked at the addresses, and of course, Chicago being a very segregated city, you would see Washington after Washington after Washington, but you could tell from those addresses that those were all African Americans. And so there was this sort of urban legend that there were no white Washingtons. So that's what I said to the mayor. I said, "I've never met a white Washington. I don't believe they exist." And he said, "Oh yes, they do exist. You'll find it down in Southern Illinois. You go down there sometime and look and ask around, you'll find them. I never had a chance to do that, but now I understand where that belief came from, and I'm sure there's maybe one of you in the room could tell me about where those white Washingtons are. And that was Harold Washington. The thing about him was that he was all about race, but he was all about race in terms of racial equity. Dick pointed out that he was a progressive mayor. He was a progressive throughout his political career. He was a fighter for racial justice throughout his political career. And we take those causes for granted now. Progressivism is the idea of the hour here at City Hall in Chicago now. We have a very progressive mayor, but back in the early 80s, that was not a common belief, a common value. He put race and equity on the map by fighting for racial justice. Now we talk about racial equity all the time. We talk about how important it is. That wasn't the conversation back then. So as Dick points out very succinctly, there were a lot of things that changed in the city around race because of Harold Washington. He came into office on the steam of primarily the African American vote. African Americans turned out for him as they had never turned out in any election before or since. He was able to register in his first campaign for mayor. He was able to register 150,000 African Americans, and almost every one of them voted for him. But he also built a coalition, the multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition, Latinos, white ethnics, what we call in those days white lakefront liberals, liberal whites in Chicago. He brought gays and lesbians into the fold. He brought community activists, housing activists. These were people were all part of this coalition that helped get him elected. And his mantra was that he was going to bring equity and fairness to Chicago. He would always say, I'm going to be fair to you wherever you are and whoever you are. Even if you didn't vote for me, I'm going to be fair to you. I'm going to go find you wherever you are and be fair to you. And that was what established him as a different kind of mayor and opened all those doors that Dick Simpson has described. It is the reason, as you mentioned, Dick, that Barack Obama came to Chicago. He knew of Harold Washington. He understood what he meant, what his progressive agenda meant, and he saw Chicago as being the kind of place where you could grow a political career and blossom and make a political career around those kinds of values. Smart cookie, Barack Obama was, and Harold Washington helped pave the way for that.
I might also comment, we somewhat acted like Harold was the same when he was a little boy and was mayor of Chicago. That's not quite accurate. His dad, Roy, besides his ministerial aspects, was an assistant corporation counsel in the city government, and was the machine precinct captain. And Harold worked his way up through the machine. As the longer he stayed in Springfield, having been elected, he began to shift, and he began to not follow the dictates. In those early days, someone like Boss Richard J. Daley would send down instructions, and then the state legislature, they'd pass around what was called the idiot sheet. And it would say, okay, on Bill 1317, vote yes. On Bill 1314, vote no. And Harold didn't do it. And as you mentioned, perhaps the pinnacle of his time was when he led the Black Caucus, and particularly in that Senate election, but in all the legislation that followed after that Senate election.
Oh, I'm very sorry, Dick, we're frozen. And now we've disappeared.
Roads, they didn't start out perfect and then worked their way back. And Harold's a good example of that. I think you can understand from downstate, sort of the conservative area that, you fit in first of all, and then later you develop your personhood and you stand out as a leader.
I would also add, Matt, in terms of his influence outside of Chicago, he was, as we've discussed, very active and very influential in the state legislature, both as a state senator and state representative. But he was, as a mayor, as a congressman and as a mayor, he was very engaged in bipartisan politics. He was very adamant about reaching out beyond his cozy political team in Chicago. He was very active in the U.S. Conference of Mayors at a time when Ronald Reagan was in power and was in the White House. And he was a leader, a leading voice in the U.S. Conference of Mayors in fighting back on some of the initiatives and policies of the Reagan administration, which were very harmful to big cities like Chicago. And he made a lot of very strong and important relationships and ties on a national level. And again, at a time when you didn't always hear as much about that kind of activity, about that kind of bipartisanship.
When he was in the Congress, he was the leading spokesman against what was called Reaganomics, the bad budgets that were produced that is bad, particularly from the point of view of Chicago, but other places in America. You see that legacy in a way passed on now, because Mayor Brandon Johnson from Chicago and Governor Pritzker are both now leading spokesmen against the policies of the current president.
Well, thank you very much, Dick and Laura. We really appreciate those insights, and I'm eager to relay any questions or comments from the audience. Anything that any of you all would like to ask or mention to Laura or Dick?
It was an interesting time in Chicago at that time. I wonder if either of them could share some thoughts about what was going on emotionally in the city during the election or the runoff of Jane Byrne, and also when he died in office, because I know that was a very emotional time too.
Great questions, thank you. Laura and Dick, did you hear those questions?
We did.
Okay, great.
I'll just make a couple of comments, and Laura can give us again a more in-depth understanding. You have to remember how tense. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Texas. I was part of the civil rights movement, so I've seen hate, I've seen race relations. I was part of the demonstrations against them, and we weren't very popular, as you might guess, down in Texas in the day. You know, when Dr. King came to Chicago, he said the hate he ran into in Chicago was worse than what he ran into in the South, which is a pretty broad indictment. Race relations in Chicago before Harold were very fraught. We were the most segregated city in America, and I won't give you the long, detailed data, but it's true. You know, it's something to be, you know, we're now the most corrupt city, but being the most racially segregated, there were absolute barriers. You know, whites didn't go down to the south side or the west side, blacks ventured only with difficulty to the north side and so forth. I used to joke you could ride on the L and you could be blindfolded and they take the blindfold off and you'd immediately know where you were going. If there were a bunch of black people in the car, you were going to the south side. If it was mixed, you were going out west because there were a number of people at Oak Park and they were white, so it'd be a divided car. You're going north, it'd be all white. So you could literally tell where you were in the city of Chicago by the racial composition. It was that segregated. And to have a black man run in those circumstances was extraordinary. And we think Harold must have had an easy time. He got like mayor and so forth, got reelected. Harold won the first election with only 36% of the vote. If Jane Byrne and Richard Daley hadn't divided the white vote, Harold Washington would never become mayor.
I would add, great points, Dick. I would add that Dick, you're correct. It wasn't an easy path for him, and he was actually a reluctant candidate. He had actually run for mayor a previous time, 4 years before that. I think it was '77, and didn't do very well. But again, it wasn't the right time. The right time came about partly because of Jane Byrne and her administration. A lot of African Americans had supported her, had a lot of hopes for her. She made a lot of promises about opportunities and change that she was going to bring to African Americans and their communities. And she disappointed a lot of people. She made some very bad appointments that were very disrespectful in terms of some of the boards and commissions that she oversaw. appointments that were very disrespectful to African Americans, and she did a number of other things that turned the African American community against her. And so black voters, particularly black activists, were looking for someone new, someone who would really represent them. And they settled on Harold Washington because he had such a distinguished career, because he was well known and well respected, and because he was such an astute politician. But he was also so astute that he didn't want to walk into a trap or into a campaign that he couldn't win. He was reluctant. He was not thrilled about the idea of running that second time. And so a number of political activists in the city got together and went to him and said, what do you need, what do you want to run? And he says, you've got to register a lot of voters. I think he asked for 100,000 new voters, something along those lines. And he also wanted them to raise $100,000 or so for that campaign. And that request was a pretty tall order at that time. But they went out and got organized. The political activists from all across the city went out and got organized, and they delivered those votes, and those voters, and they delivered that money to him. So he had to say yes. And what came out of that was interesting, and it was more than a political campaign. I covered Harold Washington, his campaign, before I went to work for him in the administration. I covered him as a reporter, and I remember sitting down with Al Rady, who was a very distinguished political activist and strategist who had once worked for Dr. King, who was running Harold Washington's campaign. And I talked to Al Rady about the campaign and what are you doing? You know, what's your strategy? You know, what's your game plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I was asking him all these very technical political questions, and he said, you know, we don't need to have all that. We don't need to talk about all that, because what we have here is a crusade. This is not a campaign. This is a crusade, and that's exactly what it was. People were energized. Not just African Americans, but people across the city were energized about that campaign, as they had never been about anything in politics before. Many people who had never voted before not only came out and voted, but came out and organized for him. So it was something that has changed Chicago forever.
Thank you so much, Laura and Dick. I think we have about one or 2 minutes left. So any last questions or comments from any of you for Laura or Dick, or for Brendan or John? Let me, I know this is potentially a big question, but maybe we just get a couple of quick answers. From the audience here, what is one thing that you would like people from Chicago to understand about this region of the state that you feel they may not understand? And for Laura or Dick or Nicole, who's joining us from Chicago, anything that you all would like people here in rural Southern Illinois to know about Chicago that may not be obvious?
Resources.
We have limited resources. That's an excellent point.
Some of us don't
I'm
even
sorry,
have
could you repeat that, because it didn't come through?
Oh, Claudia, what did you add?
I said some of us don't even have decent Wi-Fi at our homes. Yes.
Well, true. Yes, a couple of folks in the audience said that we have limited resources here in Southern Illinois, and that good Wi-Fi can be difficult to come by. Anything that you all would like to make sure that our friends here in Southern Illinois know about Chicago that may not be obvious to everyone?
Well, I would just say, and I'm sure many of you have been in Chicago, spent time here. You probably have family here. When people talk about Chicago, they talk about the Lollapalooza, they talk about, the Bears, they talk about a lot of the things that go on and are exciting opportunities in downtown Chicago, in the central part of the city. One of the things that Harold Washington pioneered was thinking about the city outside the central district and thinking about all the resources, the rich resources and opportunities in the neighborhoods. And so I encourage people, whenever they come to Chicago, to get out into the neighborhoods, because that is where the heart and soul of the city is. And you've got every language, every ethnicity, every type of food, every type of music. Whatever you want, you can find in Chicago.
One thing that might be helpful that Harold Washington did for Chicago, before Harold, particularly Richard J. Daley, but his successors, believed that the way to make a good Chicago was to build up the loop. They were coming out of World War II, and there was a decline in housing, they were clearing slums, and all that kind of stuff. The loop was where it was at, and that's where the resources were being put. Harold sponsored what was called balanced economic development, which was not only development downtown, but development in neighborhoods by meeting manufacturing and jobs and opportunities. And he believed that the neighborhoods had a source of resources that were important. If I were downstate with you folks, I would be demanding balanced economic development in the state of Illinois. To the best I understand, Southern Illinois has been suffering for some time. And Harold Washington was a champion of sharing resources, that we're better together than we are apart. And you can see that even today. For instance, our last mayor, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, had a program called Invest Southwest. She put resources of the city and the private sector in the 10 poorest neighborhoods in Chicago to build them up. And that, I think, is a rallying cry that all of us would support, particularly in this era of cutbacks when you're going to be losing Medicare, you're going to each lose more than $2,000 a year in tariff increase costs and everything from food to cars. And this is a time to build up where we need to so that we all have a better life.
Thank you very much, Dick and Laura. Any last questions or comments?
Laura, who are you a reporter for?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
He just asked, for whom have you been a reporter? I know it's quite a long and impressive list.
Yeah, actually, yes. Actually, I was at the Chicago Reporter in the early part of my career. That's where when I covered Harold Washington and went on to work in his administration. I'm currently a columnist with Chicago Tribune, and I write frequently about politics. I'm also a political commentator on the ABC station here in Chicago. But I've had a few jobs along the way, and I have to say that there hasn't been anything that's given me more honor and pleasure than having worked for Harold Washington. Because as a reporter, you only see one side of the story. You don't see how government works. You don't see how politics plays a role in governing decisions. And I was able to see that by working inside the administration. So I've kind of worn two hats over the years, and it's been a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much to Laura and Dick, and also to Brendan and John. Let's have a nice hand for all. I feel badly. I feel as if I haven't, I didn't schedule enough time into this event to make sure we had a chance for questions and comments and conversation and so on. So I know that we need to wrap up, but I also know that we probably have plenty more to talk about. So if anyone is interested in staying around just a few more minutes, you're certainly welcome to do that and ask questions of John and Brendan. And discuss anything that you'd like to discuss. On behalf of Illinois Humanities, thanks again to the Lawrence County Historical Society. Obviously, they made indispensable contributions to this program, and it is always a real honor and a pleasure to work with them. You probably all know this, but they are a real treasure here in southwestern Illinois, and Lawrence County and the region are fortunate to have them. Thanks also to Pinkstaff United Methodist Church for the opportunity to use this beautiful venue. Thanks to Ms. Robeson for the wonderful piano music earlier in the program. And thanks to all of you for being here. Again, we encourage you to complete the evaluation survey and share that with us. We really, really value your input. And lastly, personal thanks to all of you who are here, including my coworkers Nicole Rodriguez and Feiruz Abu Ghazaleh. Also our good friend Allison Thompson from Marshall Public Library, one of our Public Humanities awardees a few years ago, and my dad, John Meacham, who came over from Chester on the other side of Southern Illinois, and all of our coworkers who joined online. As some of you have probably heard, Illinois Humanities, because of major cuts to the National Endowment for the Humanities, unfortunately is having to do some staff downsizing, and consequently my time with Illinois Humanities is about to conclude. So this was my last public event, and I just want to thank you so much for sharing it with me. I couldn't think of anywhere I would rather have had my concluding event with Illinois Humanities than here in Lawrence County and here with all of you. Thank you all very much, and have a good evening.